how that fits the data. So by fairness, I'm simply concerned with the distribution of resources. So that's the sense of fairness I'm using. So if all things are equal, then fair distribution is an even distribution. I'll point out that that assumption is made in all cooperative games that I'm aware of, such as the Prisoner's Dilemma or the Stag Hunt. The cooperative gain of 2 or more players is evenly split. But we'll see that from a game theoretical and economic perspective, that fairness is pretty strictly irrational without some leverage, but even with leverage, it's a problem. So 2 classic games that have been used to investigate fairness. One is the Ultimatum game. So in the Ultimatum game, you have 2 players, at least in the 2-player version. One player proposes how to split some resource, such as $10, and the second player can either accept or reject that offer. If the second player rejects it, then both of them get nothing. If it accepts it, then that's the way that it's divided up. So the second player has some leverage, so you might think that the solution to the game could be that fairness is rational under certain circumstances, but economists and game theorists look at it from the sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium, where both players consider what the absolute rational strategy of each player comes to, and it basically comes to that the proposer should offer the least amount possible. So if it's $10 and it's divisible by pennies, then the sub-game optimal Nash equilibrium is to offer 1 penny. And anything more than that is irrational. The Dictator game is like the Ultimatum game, except that the recipient has no leverage. So it's not really a game. So it's not difficult to analyze. From a rational point of view, the dictator should offer nothing. That's basic solution to that game. So there have been hundreds of experiments. I have no idea, but many hundreds of experiments conducted by economists, anthropologists, all over the world. I want to mention, because I think it's important, the standard experimental control, which is really important, is anonymity. So oftentimes, the participants in these experiments don't even have, they're just told they have a partner. They don't even really have one. And this is a key methodological assumption to avoid extra game influences on the outcome. But I think it makes it hard to explain the outcome of these experiments. So let me show you some data from a couple of meta-analyses that have been done. So this is a meta-analysis done in 2004. I think there were 600 experiments in it. And so this is the average offer, so 40%. This is the standard deviation across studies. This is really interesting. I'll come back to this. This is the acceptance rejection level. So on average, the second player will accept 16% of the resource. This is the Dictator game, and on average it's close to 30%. Huge amount of variation, especially when you look across different societies. But in all societies, you see violation of the rational solution, which is to give nothing. There have been lots of formal models of the Ultimatum game. There's a recent paper that came out in 2016 that classified 36 Ultimatum game models, and I think there's more than that, into 6 different categories. I think, one problem for some of these is that it's difficult to apply them directly to explaining the results of dictator game experiments because they involve knowledge of what the other player's reputation has been. But I think the overarching problem is that they all basically seek to show that there are other Nash equilibria, which is well known in this game. There's indefinitely many. If it's infinitely divisible, there's infinitely many Nash equilibria to the ultimatum game. And the problem that's posed is, how do you get Nash equilibria that are far away from the subgame Nash equilibrium? So in all of these models, the exception-rejection levels, theoretically, are very close to the offer level. But when we go back to the data, there's a problem. Because if you look here, there's a huge gap between the acceptance level in the data and the rejection level in the ultimatum game. That's never been theoretically explained. Why is it? And in societies with small populations, this is really low. They don't reject small offers. One of the models to attempt to explain the dictator game in biological markets is that if you have fewer dictators than recipients, recipients have knowledge of dictators, then they will choose to play with those dictators that are more generous. A couple of problems why I don't think that this explains the behavior in the dictator game is that, of course, it implies that there's knowledge of what, in these experiments, what the dictator will give, and I think it tacitly turns it into an ultimatum game or a bargaining game. So the dictator game is really difficult to explain. It's probably even harder to explain than the ultimatum game, because the second player has no leverage. And fair players don't even have an advantage when they play, the probability of playing other fair players is unity. So it's not possible to find an evolutionary stable strategy for this game, or even a generalized Hamilton rule that favors fairness even when you only interact with other fair agents. So let me illustrate this. So consider two groups. Well, let's say there's an even number of agents in each group for simplicity. And randomly, you decide half of them as dictators in the fair group. They split, say, $10. And the unfair group, the dictators keep it, and the fair ones, or the others, don't receive anything. Now, suppose we play this over and over again, and each player in each group has a 50% probability over time of being a dictator. So in the fair group, what happens is that their expected payoff is 5, because they always split it. Everyone gets 5, so there's no variation, just 5. If we consider the unfair group, well, you have a random probability of 5 of being the dictator, keeping it all, or getting nothing. But in the long run, the expected payoff is also 5. So there is no expected difference between the two groups. So you can see that this is a real problem. There is a difference. And could this difference be a difference between the groups? There is variance in payoff that accumulates between the two groups. In the very simple case that I outlined, you can calculate the difference in fairness between these groups. So for a completely selfish group, the variance for the example that I gave would be 25, and for the fair group would be 0. So how could this variance make any difference? We really don't have theories about the role of variance in fairness and cooperation. So when I encounter problems like this, my approach is to think about constructing virtual experiments. That is, I'm going to create agents that behave like the agents I'm interested in understanding how these results come from these experimental games and see what evolves. I really, when I started this out, I did not have a theoretical idea about how this would work. So let me describe the model. So I'm going to place agents in a two-dimensional discrete space. The reason I want to make it spatial is that I want to model agents socially interacting and allow population structure to emerge. This will create differential probabilities of association between between phenotypes. So I'm going to let my agents be mobile. I'll say one thing that is always tricky when developing virtual experiments is to decide how much to add to the models. You can make a huge mistake by putting too much in. You can also make a huge mistake by putting too little in. My view is that I want to have generically biologically realistic agents that are going to evolve. So I want to include some basic features. So I want agents to exhibit at least aggregation as a very basic form of social interaction. So they will attempt to aggregate with at least one other agent. They reproduce locally, so that creates correlations in similar phenotypes. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, population structure emerges from that. Also, the agents will have a lifespan. That lifespan can be modeled in different ways. You can assign a lifespan at each agent as they're born or introduced, or you can have a probability of them dying at a certain rate. It doesn't really matter. So when they reproduce, this is different from a lot of different models that are used game theoretically. They have to acquire sufficient resources to reproduce. Also, this differs. We want to control how much resources they can accumulate over time. I mean, organisms don't have unlimited capacity, but you can explore different levels of being able to store resources over time with no limit on it at all. And then we'll introduce reproduction, heritability, and mutation. And the last one, parental investment. So when an offspring is reproduced, an agent invests a certain amount of its resources, which it passes on. We subtract it from the agent, give it to its offspring. This turns out to be important. I'm not going to go into this because I think here's the event decision diagram for each one. I guess this PowerPoint will be a PDF, so if there's any detailed questions about how this works, you can refer to that or ask me later. So this is a depiction of what I would see when I visually represent a simulation. So this would be the initial conditions. So from now on, you can think about all the simulations I talk about this way. Agents are randomly placed in space. The reason they're red is because I'm starting them out as all unfair, or they don't share at all. And then early in a simulation, they cluster together and population structure emerges. So there's 4,000 agents in this simulation. And then later, I'll get to this, different levels of fairness begin to emerge, and they're colored in terms of purple and blue. The more purple or blue they are, the more they share resources. And so that you get an idea of what it looks like. So this is a clip from that simulation in the end. So you can see agents occasionally move around and migrate. When they lose contact with another individual, they search for another group. So there is some migration. You'll notice that one of the interesting features is that you see that there's different colors in different places. So what's happening is happening locally in space and time as far as how they're evolving fairness as we move along. So I ran 3 types of simulation experiments, which I'll refer to as multi-level selection experiments, in which we just let the agents interact. They form population structure, and they will tend to interact with individuals of similar phenotypes over time. And then the second, which is a control condition, is individual selection only experiments. And what you can do is it's just like the multi-level experiments. You get population structure emerging, except we swap agents, locations randomly. So what you effectively get is population mixing. And so you remove population structure while still maintaining structural relationships, which is kind of important because when an agent in these simulations is moving around in space, they may not have anyone to play with. So this way, you keep the conditions exactly the same, just like you would want to do in a real experiment. And then the third condition is what we call a group level experiment. So we just take 2 homogeneous groups of agents, and they play against purely fair agents that split. And then we can look at different degrees of splitting, from completely selfish to completely hyper-fair, where they just give everything away, and see how when the 2 groups compete against each other, they don't interact. They're only competing in fecundity, how many offspring they can produce, and we see what groups win out over time. So this is just an individual result to give you an idea what simulations look like. So here is for the Dictator game. The blue line is the metadata mean. It's a little over 28%. This is an evolving population. I think there's 500 agents here. It's small. nicely, I found it does scale up, so I'll show you that as well. But here's how the population changed over time. Oh, I know what I'll do. So here's how the population changed over time. So it fluctuates up and down. Most of these fluctuations are due to small population size. And we see that it goes from unfair, or aggregating, and then we start seeing fair agents emerge. You see these purple ones that are splitting some of the resources. So what we did is systematically simulated parameter sweeps for, well, more than these parameters, of course. We looked at different levels of payoff. But the ones we thought were really interesting were the amount of parental investment, 25, 50%, 75% into each offspring. And then how much resources could they store? Just enough to reproduce, more than that, unlimited, so not placing any constraints. And then this is the mean of all 12 combinations. The dashed line is the mean for the dictator. The shaded area is the standard deviation. Along the horizontal axis is the population density. So we ran these simulations with different densities of agents. Clear over here, every single cell was occupied by an agent, completely dense. So what happens in general is that the degree of fairness decreases with density, because you're basically breaking down some of the population structure by having increasingly dense amounts of agents. But for low density, in the 1% range, most of the simulations fall within the variation observed in the data, and then it drops off. So this is the results of the multi-level data. Then, on the bottom, we randomly swap agents. So the simulations are exactly the same. We just randomly take every pair of agents and randomly swap them. And what happens is that they evolve basically down to very low levels. We do see for very small population densities, 50 and 2,500, that we get some higher levels due to basically random effects in small sample size. But as the populations increase to 1%, it basically drops down to a little bit over the mutation rate. Now, for the group selection experiments, we start out two populations. They are isolated from each other, but the overall population size limit is held at, let's see, I think there's 125 in each one, so it's held at 250, and then they're allowed to compete over time, and eventually one wins out either by chance or because there's some advantage to it. And here we have the results of these group simulation experiments. So they're always playing against, one group is always playing against completely fair agents. And the competing groups are in the range of 0 to 0.5. And so we see that as it's close to 0, depending on these combination of parameters, the fair group wins more. So it's plotted in terms of the losing group. So groups that are less fair, they don't do quite as well. As they approach fairness, let's say you have a group that splits that offers 40%, there's very little difference between the ones that completely split. Then, if you go over here, these are hyperfair individuals. They give more than 50%, and these individuals over here give 100% split. They keep nothing, they give it all away, and it's completely symmetrical. At the group level, they don't do very well. So what's going on here? So the expected payoff for agents in fair and unfair groups are exactly the same, but the variance in resources in the unfair group is greater than the fair group. So there is a variance difference. So what is going on is that fair groups are more efficiently channeling resources into the reproduction of young. I have an analytical argument that I think kind of helps with this intuition. So let's consider these two highly idealized groups that I talked about earlier. One, completely fair agents and completely unfair agents. Let's make some simplifying assumptions that make it easy to understand. Let's suppose both groups start out with exactly the same amount of resources. Let's say they need 100 units to reproduce and they start out with 50. And we're all right here. And let's suppose we have a population of 1,000. Well, what we would like to do is calculate how long it takes for individuals in each population to reproduce. So for the unfair, we're going to have initially some really lucky individuals that have been dictators 5 times in a row that are going to receive 10 units of resource and reach 100 after 5 rounds, and then some very, very lucky ones until we reach 10, and about 60% of the unfair will have reproduced by then. And at 10, all the fair individuals will get to reproduce. Now you notice that over time, they converge. But here's the thing. Suppose they're dying at some rate. It can be very small, and let's just consider a linear death rate, say 1%. So what's going to happen is that the population size is going to decrease. Now, if you calculate the maximum reproduction, multiply that times this curve, it turns out that it will never reach the reproduction output of the fair group here. Now, this is a very simple argument, but I think this is what's going on in these simulations. Now, let's turn to the ultimatum game. So these simulations are exactly the same. What I've done for convenience is I haven't plotted all the outcomes. I've just plotted the range of outcomes for the 12 possible parameter sweeps that I did in the previous one. This is the mean level of the data, of the meta-analytic data for the ultimatum game with the standard deviation. And this is the meta-analytic acceptance rejection level with the variation. And this is the simulation results. And we see that for even a wider range, that they fit into the data. We basically see simulation results that fit there. Interestingly, for very low population densities, we see acceptance rejection levels that are in the range of what is seen in the empirical data. This over here is the random swapping. It's really interesting that it goes down, but it doesn't go to 0. This is interesting because I think about 1995, when I was talking about the Ultimatum game models, there were some random noise models that came out, and they predicted that because of noisy acceptance levels, this will push up the proposal levels. And in fact, I'm forgetting the authors, but they predicted that it would push it as high as 20% inner random noise. So this is basically what you would expect from just random noise with the Ultimatum game. So the difference between that and this is what's added on by the efficient channeling of resources into offspring. And here is a simulation with 12,500 agents. And this is over a number of trials. And what happens as you increase the number of agents, it tends to, well, you get the results do scale up. And you also then see that the population fluctuates around what looks like an equilibrium point. So when you do these kinds of agent-based models, it can be kind of difficult at times to determine what is the stable equilibrium. But if you can scale these up, you can begin to see convergence. And so this is the level of, for the swapping, the offer level. This is the exception rejection level that evolved, and this is the swapping level, acceptance rejection level that evolved. So what I want to go over is comparing this model to the data and what it offers. So the simulation mean offers are similar to the experimental mean offers. And this all depends, though, on different parameters that you set up. But it definitely, this kind of model can get you into the range that you're looking for. I think one really interesting aspect is this predicts variation results. Now, you could say that the variation that we see in these experimental games is just noise, but it does have a very clear pattern in these experiments. I mean, and it's very replicable. So I mean, in my classes, I don't have money to pay my students, but I set up Dictator games where I just pass out a sheet of paper, describe the situation that they're going to get $10, and imagine how they would split it with a randomly assigned classmate. They fill it out, fold up the paper, we count it up, it always turns out the same. The average is somewhere between 30 and 45%. The mode is almost always 50-50 split, with some offers between 0 and some hyper fair offers. It always turns out that way. Is that variation, does that have something to do with the theoretical foundations for fairness? Well, in these simulations, you know, if we go back to the depictions I showed you earlier of agents in landscape, what happens is they don't all turn fair. You get this distribution of changing aggregates of fairness. So you get a cluster of fair agents. They may get invaded by mutation or by migration, and they decline, and another group pops up. And so this model actually predicts that we would see variation in results. And I think it satisfies anonymity assumptions because these agents have no memory. They're not learning by assessing the behavior of other agents. Though I don't think that this model is inconsistent with other explanations. It provides a reason for thinking why fair distributions or distributions are fair. And then for the ultimatum game, basically the same points hold, except one additional one is this acceptance rejection level. As far as I know, no other modeling approach can predict high levels of fair distribution of resources with very low rejection levels. And that's because what's driving the high offer rate is the advantage of when you're in a group of others, or you're in close proximity or have a high probability of interacting with other fair individuals, then you have the opportunity to more efficiently channel resources into offspring that have the same phenotype. So this also predicts variation within and between experiments and the anonymity assumption. So these simulation results indicate that fairness really isn't irrational if we move above the level of the individual and consider what's happening with individuals that are systematically interacting with each other, where in particular population structure can emerge, but anything that leads to phenotypes associating with each other, if we have correlations between phenotypes, will lead to this efficient reproduction. So again, at the level of aggregates or association of phenotypes, it's the efficient channeling of resources to offspring. One thing I could go into much more discussion is that when you take a generic biological approach, it also gives you insights that you could follow up with more realistic models or application to real systems, that resource quantity, parental investment, resource storage, lifespan can all affect the outcome of the sharing that you see. And I think you can see that this creates the opportunity for exploring different specific theoretical influences on fairness across societies. And I just want to say that I think conducting virtual experiments, letting theory emerge from your best understanding of what's going on, can be a very fruitful approach to theoretical explanations. So I think I'll just leave it here.